Good evening, class. We're going to spend, it's not going to take long, just a few minutes. This is going to be a review video for your midterm. And as I did for quiz one, quiz two, I've put together a few notes and uh, doesn't necessarily mean what I'm going to talk about is going to be on the test. And if I don't talk about something, doesn't necessarily mean it won't be on the test. But to me, these are some um, I guess, salient type concepts or information that I feel is important to understand as we move through this macroeconomic class. One thing I do want to point out and talk about is, and I can't remember whether I addressed it in the reviews for quiz one or quiz two, but don't, whatever you do, get all confused and stressed out about the math. There may be some math problems on any of these quizzes, your midterm, your final, but the math, if you've read the text or if you've listened to me in the videos on each chapter, this is not high-powered calculus. This is basic algebra. It's rearranging terms, it's addition, it's multiplication, it's rate of change. The formulas, as you go through the text, are pretty simple, just like in the micro class that I taught, and I used a text that was written by this same group of authors. It's not They're introductory classes, introduction to microeconomics, introduction to macroeconomics. They're to get you a basic understanding of economic terms and a basic understanding of how the economy works, not in the United States, but in other countries. And again, the math that they have in here, just take, if there are problems on the midterm, take a deep breath, go back, think about what the questions are asking. And again, a lot of times, especially in the micro class, and you're probably going to find this here in the macro class too, a lot of times it is distilled down to just basic ratios. If they'll ask questions about what happens to the ratio. If the numerator goes up and the denominator doesn't, what happens? If the numerator stays the same and the denominator goes up, what happens? Just don't get stressed out over the math. And second point is, as you're taking tests, whether it's micro or macro, and you are thinking about questions on the test, especially if the test asks, if something goes up, what happens, to some other variable, draw that thing out, especially if it's talking about supply and demand. If it's talking about price and quantities demanded, or, the movement of the demand curve or the movement of the supply curve, draw that thing out. Draw it out. Price on the vertical, quantity on the horizontal, downward sloping demand, upward sloping supply. Draw it out, play around with it, and it makes it fairly simple on most of these tests or most of these questions. And with that in mind, we're going to start. And remember, we're talking about the midterm, and the midterm is going to be chapters 1 through 6. And if you remember, the first 3 to 4 chapters in this text was basically a review of microeconomic information. So with that in mind, just remember that economists are concerned with scarcity of resources, the choices among alternatives. The economists, more is preferred to less. We have unlimited wants and limited resources. Remember the 3 basic pillars of economic thought, what sets economics away, separate or sets it apart from other social sciences, because all social sciences study choice. But as an economist or in the economic framework, we're also more concerned about opportunity cost, right? Opportunity cost, self-interest, optimization, maximization, minimization. You're going to really get into the weeds on that as we move forward in this class. And decisions at the margin, marginal decisions. So opportunity cost, self-interest, decisions at the margin. Always remember those 3 pillars. And as we get into the economic systems, and you've got you've got economic systems that span a huge continuum, and it goes from economic systems like you're going to see in Korea and Cuba, where the government dictates and enrolls everything in North Korea and Cuba. To the other end of that spectrum, it's more capitalistic. It's more United States. It's more UK, Singapore, up on that end. And then you've got all these other countries, all these other global economies in between. Some closer to the approach, China and Russia are probably down here closer to like Venezuela, North Korea, Cuba. And you've got, Germany, France, Sweden, probably up here closer to the UK and United States, but still, because of government intervention, they're not really a capitalistic market. But when we come to economic systems and start to talk about it, what do? In a production process of goods and service, what do economic systems do? Well, they're like markets. One thing, they bring buyers and sellers together. But otherwise, or in addition to that, they determine what's going to be produced, how are we going to produce it, for whom are we going to produce it, and lastly, how are entities, profit maximizing entities, going to preserve some resources for the future. When we're talking about production process, we get into factors of production. Labor, capital stock, which is not the same, but capital stock is not the same as bonds and stock options, or bonds and stock certificates. We've got natural resources, which the one that economists most frequently focus on is land. We've got the impact of technology, and it's, again, we're talking about technology of the production process, that black box where inputs come in, spin through the black box, they go out the other end as outputs. An economist, if you actually think about it, are not too concerned about the black box, what goes on there. They're more concerned with how efficient these inputs can go into the black box and come out the other end as outputs. And then you've got, sitting on top of all this, you've got the entrepreneurs. They're the guys that are trying to change processes, trying to make things more efficient, trying to bring new products to market, all in return for what they think is going to be a high return on investment or high profitability. And as you start to think about some of these factors of production, land's kind of dicey, because, and a lot of natural resources are, because it's difficult. You can't make land, and there's only so many acres of land in the United States. If you think about Nashville, just think about the university there at Fisk. How can you expand that university? There's not that many directions Fisk can expand, or Meharry Medical College. There's not a lot of opportunities to expand in that given location. Now, they could have some branch campuses and some remote sites, but in those locations, land it's pretty much a fixed commodity, or pretty much a fixed factor of production. Capital stock. And remember, capital stock differentiates from financial capital, because capital stock, it has to have been produced, and it must be used to produce other goods and services. The woo-woo coffee machine at Starbucks, the microwave that they make your, sandwiches that you go in and order. Radiology machine that they use at the hospital, laboratory equipment. A lot of these things have been produced, and they are used to produce other goods and services. And also remember that ceteris paribus, economists love to invoke that. It makes the world simpler for us, makes our economic models work in a more simplified process, means all other things equal, or all other things unchanged. Then we talk for a few minutes, or at least the text talks for a few minutes, about demand shifters and supply shifters, the things that move the demand curve and the supply curve. Demand shifters, you've got price, you've got buyer preferences, you've got prices of alternatives, you've got buyer's income, and especially disposable income, you've got demographic factors, age, sex of the population, And you've got buyer expectations, what the buyers think the future is going to bring. On the supply side, you've got cost of inputs, technology, returns from alternatives. Again, opportunity cost there, seller expectations, natural events, and number of sellers. And natural events on the as far as supply shifters, it can be huge natural events, especially in agricultural commodities, grains, cattle, livestock in general. Think of natural disasters, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes. So natural events impact a lot of the supply across not only the United States, but across the global economy. And above all other things equal, again, all of the things unchanged, all of the things equal, price is going to be a driver, or maybe the main driver, when you're talking about shifters and making and the ability to make things work and move, especially on the demand side. Then we talked for a few minutes about GDP, gross domestic product. You've got the nominal GDP, which is the current price times the current quantity. It's a market value of all final goods and services produced in an economy in a given year. Real GDP, they take the price of the base year and multiply it by the quantity of the current year. So nominal GDP, price and quantity of the current period. I just said year because that's typically what they're talking about. And real GDP, they take the price of the base year, multiply by the quantity of the current year. And they do that why? Because when you're looking at nominal GDP, you're not sure whether GDP has increased because of production efficiency or has it increased because of price. And because of that, a lot of economists are more concerned with real GDP than they are nominal GDP. Real GDP, it's the total value of final goods and services adjusted to eliminate the impact of price changes, impact the issues of inflation, recession. Think about given the price increases and the inflation rates of the last couple of years, think what that is going to do to nominal GDP. And if you want to really measure output, you have to take and you have to adjust for those. Also, when you're talking about GDP, they threw out the formula for the per capita. And that's basically real GDP divided by population. And in some countries, especially some global economies, it's extremely useful for an economist to convert real GDP to per capita GDP because that takes into account the changes in the populations. And especially it's going to be important as we move forward and try to measure real GDP based on the impacts that we had during the COVID pandemic, where a lot of lives were lost, and that's going to significantly impact the population in some global economies. Also talked about price levels. It's the average level of prices in an economy. We spent just a few minutes talking about the business cycle. And remember, when you're looking at the business cycle, you're plotting real GDP on the vertical, and you're plotting outputs, or you're plotting of the other variable on the horizontal. So you're looking at the business cycle, real GDP and the business cycle. Business cycle is remember, it's definitely not predictable and it's definitely not regular. So it's extremely important to business, but unlike a lot of cycles, it is so irregular and so unpredictable, it makes it extremely difficult to predict. And that business cycle, remember, it's coming up and hits a peak. What's that? Coming up this side, it's expansion. That's so that you're coming up, you're increasing on the real GDP over time. Remember, real GDP on the vertical, time on the horizontal. So over time, you're increasing, and economists refer to that as expansion. You hit the peak, you start down the other side, and that's in the recession, according to the economists, because real GDP is decreasing over time. You hit the trough, or where it bottoms out and it starts up again, and we're going back to expansion again. It hits that next peak, starts down again, recession, and that's the cyclical nature of the business cycle. And the business cycle runs from one peak to the next, right? Peak to peak is your business cycle. In between those two peaks, you've got recession coming down, it bottoms out at the trough, and the expansion comes up the other side. So just remember that. And then we spent just a few minutes talking about flow variables and stock variables. Flow variables measure something over a period of time. Stock variables are more a snapshot in time or a point in time. Flow variables, they're almost like time series data, where time series data, it's, you're looking at one variable and tracking it over spaced intervals. Whereas cross-sectional data, it's many variables at a point in time. So think about flow variables, mortgage payments, something that you're paying on, X number of dollars, over time, maybe on a monthly basis. Maybe you're trying to pay off your credit card and you've worked out some deal with, a lender, and you're paying, twice a month. Whereas, stock variables, it's more, you pick up the phone and call the bank and say, hey, here it is, today's Tuesday morning, what's the balance in my checking account? That's more of a stock variable. And also, when we're talking about, I'm kind of flipping around here a little, but going back to GDP, it measures the impact of growth on society's well-being. That's why global economies, and the United States is no exception, that's why global economies and the government, through monetary policy, and we'll get into that later, but through monetary and fiscal policy, they want the potential output to be plugging along, because as that potential output's plugging along, it's going to increase society's well-being. And remember, when you're calculating GDP, what are the components of GDP? Consumption, usually personal consumption, private investment, government expenditures, net exports. And this is really the easy part of macroeconomics, where we're talking about GDP, and then this is a really simplified model. Because once we get on down the road and we start bringing in price level and interest rates, it's foreign exchange, it's going to get a little more complicated. But this is the easy part right here. So you've got personal consumption, and usually that's upper 60s to 70%. Got another 17% personal investment. On average, another 17% for government purchases, and then lastly about 13% on net exports. And again, all of these numbers can change, but historically, that's kind of been the averages, the best guesses. Want to make sure that you understand on government purchases. Government purchases does not equate to government spending, and so the authors talk about government purchases in fairly significant detail. And they also differentiate between the two by saying spending, it's, probably transfer payments, and they get into it, spend quite a bit of time on transfer payments. Transfer payments is probably 50% of all government spending. And people will say, well, what do you mean by transfer payments? Social Security payments to old guys, EBT cards for electronic benefit transfer, and to have taken the place of food stamps. So it's government subsidies. They've also got the WIC program, women, infants, and children. Women, infants, and children. Military pensions, civil service pensions. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about spending. It's government outlays of cash that doesn't fall into the government purchase segment of the government purchase component of the calculation of GDP. And then the authors touch base just a little, and I wish they'd probably spend a little more time on it. Macroeconomic, questions that we're always trying to answer is: are we producing what we're capable of producing, right? So are we setting out here on this production possibilities curve? Are we producing what we're capable of producing? And are we providing material comfort to people in society? Remember, material comfort. Go back to what is GDP? GDP measures the impact of growth on society's well-being. Society's well-being, material comfort to members of society. And this is where, when we're looking at society's well-being and the material comfort to people in society, this is where the government's going to get in, and they like to play in the sandbox. Because the government, whether it's federal, state, local, county, most people in government think they know better than anybody else what we should or shouldn't have to be to improve the well-being of society. And they make a distinction back to GDP. They make that distinction between, remember, the definition of GDP talks about final goods and services, which is different than intermediate goods and services. Final goods and services: house, car, computer. And if you think about intermediate goods and services, think about building a house. The lumber that goes into building the house, or the steel that goes into the steel frame house, the bricks, the concrete blocks. Think about Starbucks. What's the final good and service at Starbucks? It's that cup of coffee you walk out of there with. It's that sandwich that you take home. It's that muffin that you buy for breakfast. It's that cup of tea. It's a hot chocolate. Those are the final goods and services. Think about the intermediate products: the milk, the materials that it took to make the muffins, the sandwiches, the coffee beans that they grind. All of those are considered intermediate goods and services. And then the authors get into price level. It's the average price level in the economy, and it's measured by CPI, CPE. You've got the implicit price deflator in there. And they spend a few minutes talking about some definitions. So inflation, it's an increased average price levels, and it's positive rate of change in prices. We've seen over the last few years, we've really seen a positive rate of change in prices. Hyperinflation, very high and ever accelerating inflation. They talk about the hyperinflation. You see it in some of the countries in South America. We had some really out of whack inflation during the Jimmy Carter years. They talk about disinflation. Disinflation is kind of one of those weird animals, and we probably so far we're in 23, we're in 24. So 23, 22 was when inflation was just completely out of control here. 23, we were still having high inflation, but it was increasing at a decreasing rate as compared to 2022. So in that case, that would be disinflation. We're still getting the price increases, but it's increasing at a decreasing rate. And then you've got deflation, which right now, supposedly it's happening in China as they're having an issue with deflation. It's a decrease in average price levels. It's a negative rate of change. And then one that they don't spend a lot of time on in the text, and it's one that economists are the most concerned about, is stagflation. Inflation and economic growth is stagnant. So you've got Inflation is at a high level, or at least increasing. You've got economic growth is stagnant. That's where you get stagflation. And you've also got unemployment remains steadily high. So bad combination. Inflation, slow to non-existent growth, unemployment high. That is a terrible combination, and that's why economists are more concerned about the ability of whether it's the central bank trying to manage monetary policy or it's the government trying to manage fiscal policy. But the yahoos in Washington are all concerned about stagflation. And then when we talked about price index, they give a little example in the text, and it's the current cost over the base year cost times 100. Simple formula. If people give you numbers, you plug those numbers in. You're talking about three variables: the price index, the current cost, the base year cost. And as you've all learned in your math classes, three variables, if you know two of them, you plug those puppies in and you start cranking numbers. Because if you have three variables and you know two of them, you can always find this third one. Sometimes you want to rearrange the little terms. So, you may want to take and with the formula they give you and kind of plug around and rearrange some terms, but it's still three variables. If you know two of them, good to go. Four variables, three of them, good to go. Four variables, two of them, then you have to kind of work on that one. And I'm not sure that, it could be really difficult. And, hopefully for your sake, we don't end up with a situation where there's four variables and two of them. Consumer Price Index, CPI. And again, when we talk about the CPI, it's a fixed basket. That's one of the downsides of CPI. It's a fixed basket. The Personal Consumption Expenditure Price Index, the PCE, it's not a fixed basket. It is allowed to change from time to time. Now, the downside on the fixed basket of the Consumer Price Index is a lot of companies tie their cost of living, their COLA, cost of living adjustment. They tie that COLA, that cost of living adjustment, to the CPI. Social Security beneficiaries are constantly complaining because it's, Social Security payments are tied to that CPI. Pensions, I mean, there are a lot of financial reimbursement issues for individuals in the United States because a lot of it is tied to the CPI. And then lastly, you've got that implicit price deflator. And again, little three variable formula: nominal GDP divided by the real GDP multiplied by 100. Pretty easy. If somebody gives you some formulas, start looking at what you have, start thinking about the formula. Three variables, two of them, plug and chug. Again, nominal GDP, it's the price of the current period times the quantity of the current period, whereas real GDP is price of the base period times the quantity of the current period. And if you want to know the real value of something, let's say somebody says, what's the real value of my wage? Well, you can get the real value of your wage by taking your wage and whatever that time period is, divided by the CPI of that time period, multiplied by 100. I'll give you the real value. They were talking about that. The authors also talked about the equation of exchange, and it's the money supply times the velocity equals the average price times GDP. And that's now you're talking about you're having to do some higher level math. You're having to do some multiplying and some dividing on that. However, they do take and make it a little simpler for you, and they give you a little formula that's got the four variables, and they change the formula into its basic addition and subtraction. It's the change. It's the percent change in the money supply plus a percent change in velocity equals a percent change in price plus a percent change in GDP. Pretty easy. Somebody gives you 3% changes, you plug them in and figure out what the fourth one is, figure out the missing one. Also, if you remember in the text, they talk about velocity and GDP is slow to change. And because it's slow to change, economists have kind of distilled it down and developed this direct relationship between supply money and the price level. Remember we talked about it? Money supply goes up, price level goes up. Money supply goes down, price level goes down. They talk about issues with the price level. It's a situation where you've got too many dollars chasing too fewer goods. So again, government's going to be looking at how do they control that money supply, and we'll get into that in some of the later chapters. Inflation impacts every market transaction. And why does it impact it? It impacts it because of the adjustment to purchasing power. Look at the purchasing power of your dollar over the last couple of years. I mean, go to the grocery store. It is, to me, it's one of the most depressing jobs I have on a weekly basis is going to the grocery store. And it doesn't matter whether I'm going to Costco, Sam's Club, Publix, Kroger's, Aldi's, Walmart, I mean, Lidl, they're all, it's the same everywhere. You walk in and you walk out with your groceries and you look at your credit card receipt or you look at the change you got back from $100 bill and you think, what is the world coming to? So inflation is going to impact your purchasing power. And again, you use CPI to adjust wages, transfer payments, redistribution policies. And again, when we're talking about price index, don't forget it. It's a pretty straightforward formula. The current cost of the market basket divided by the base year cost of the market basket multiplied by 100. Also, it's probably going to be helpful, and you know, there's certain things that you just need to remember in economics. The formula for the slope of a curve. Also, the formula for the percent change. Percent change is equal to the new value minus the old value divided by the old value times 100. That gets your percent change. And for me, one of the professors when I was in graduate school said, yeah, that's great. But he starts writing it up on the board and he says, you know, you rearrange the terms and what is percent change really telling you? You take the new number divided by the old number minus 1 multiplied by 100. The same thing is saying new value minus old value divided by old value times 100. Again, math magic. Rearrange a few terms and it simplifies that equation. The new number divided by the old number minus 1 times 100. And the last thing I think we're going to talk about and I did talk about the implicit price deflator. We talked about it a couple of times. It's a nominal GDP divided by the real GDP multiplied by 100. And always remember the relationship between the money supply and the price level, because you may have to get that tattooed somewhere, because it is going to be one of those things that you will have to remember and going forward. So make sure you write it down on a note card, put it up on your wall in your dorm room, and always remember there's certain things we're going to get into as we move forward, especially when we're talking about money supply, price, interest rates, price of bonds, because remember what I said earlier in this review, all other things equal, price is a driver. So always remember that relationship between money supply and inflation, or money supply and price level. If you've got any issues, let me know. Otherwise, the next time we get together, we're going to be probably doing a review video for quiz number 3. Talk to you soon. Thank you.